This move establishes central control, opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, and prepares for the development of pieces, commonly leading to openings like the queen's pawn game or queen's gambit. This move initiates a flexible response to white's central pawn advance, preparing to contest the center with pieces and potentially adopt various Indian defenses. This move, 2, c4, immediately challenges black's central control and initiates the queen's pawn game, often leading into established theoretical battles like the Indian defenses, by fighting for the d5 square. This move, 2, e6, signals black's intention to adopt a solid, classical structure, preparing to develop the kingside bishop and aiming for a queen's gambit declined or Nimzo Indian type of position. This move develops a knight to its most natural square, reinforcing control of the central light squares and preparing to support the e4 advance, common in many Indian defenses. This move, often seen in the Nimzo Indian defense, immediately challenges white's central control by targeting the nc3 and creating potential imbalances in the pawn structure after white recaptures. This move solidifies white's pawn center and opens a diagonal for the queen, preparing to develop the kingside pieces and castling. This move initiates a central pawn tension, aiming to challenge white's queenside space and potentially open lines for black's pieces. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, prepares for kingside castling, and supports the central pawn push d4, all while avoiding the pin that would occur on c2. This move initiates a Nimzo Indian defense structure, aiming to contest white's central pawn majority and potentially create imbalances. This move, na2, aims to develop the knight while preparing to castle kingside and potentially support af3 advance, to solidify the center and discourage black's central pawn breaks. This move is a principled response, aiming to challenge white's central pawn structure and open lines for black's pieces, typically seen in various queen's pawn openings like the Catalan or Queen's Indian systems, aiming for dynamic counterplay. This move decisively opens the c-file and exchanges central pawns, aiming to clarify the pawn structure and prepare for piece development in the center. This move recaptures the pawn in the center, developing a piece and preparing to challenge white's central pawn majority in the Catalan or Queen's Indian defense. This move forces black's bishop to either retreat or be exchanged, preventing it from exerting pressure on white's queenside and solidifying white's pawn structure. This capture opens the c-file, creating immediate central tension and initiating a strategic battle for pawn structure control. Capturing the pawn opens the a-file and develops the rook, but also creates an isolated d-pawn for black which will be a long-term strategic target. This pawn capture opens lines for black's pieces and creates a favorable pawn majority on the queenside, aiming to exploit white's slightly compromised structure after the exchange on d4. This move opens the b-file for your rook, creating active counterplay against black's queenside pawns and potentially challenging for control of the central squares with your increased pawn majority. This move securely tucks the king away, a necessary step in this variation of the Queen's Indian defense to avoid potential kingside attacks and prepare for central pawn play. This move decisively seizes the center, aiming to exploit the misplaced white knight on e2 and create attacking chances by opening lines. This move initiates the retreat of the knight from the d5 outpost, preparing to redeploy to a more active square like b6 to support the kingside and potentially contest central squares. This move develops the bishop to an active diagonal, eyeing the weak f7 square and preparing to support a future e5 pawn push. This pawn thrust challenges white's centralized knight and prepares to open the e-file for your rook, aiming to gain counterplay in the center. This move actively develops the bishop, preparing to castle and simultaneously challenging black's central control by targeting the d5 square. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to challenge white's central pawn structure and potentially control key squares. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, targeting black's knight on b6 and preparing to challenge the d5 square, aiming to improve white's piece activity and control of the center. This move prepares to activate the rook along the e-file and potentially challenge white's control of the central squares. White aims to exploit black's slightly loose pawn structure on the queenside by improving the bishop's scope and potentially targeting weaknesses. The move qc7 prepares to challenge white's influential bishop on b5 and activates the queen, potentially supporting pawn advances or improving coordination of black's pieces. Castling kingside is a crucial strategic decision to safeguard the king and activate the rook, preparing for future middlegame operations by connecting the rooks. This move repositions the knight to an active outpost on c4, challenging white's pieces and aiming to disrupt their coordination, potentially preparing further pawn advances or piece exchanges. This move aims to challenge black's dominant light-squared bishop and prepare to centralize the queen, potentially supporting a future kingside attack or defending against black's counterplay. This move prepares to develop the queenside bishop to a more active square, reinforcing the pawn structure while potentially challenging white's control of the c4-8 diagonal. The exchange of bishops simplifies the position and resolves white's minor spatial disadvantage, opening lines for white's rooks and potentially creating attacking opportunities on the kingside. This recapture on c4 activates the bishop, aiming to pressure white's queenside pawns and contest the open c-file. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the weak dark squares on black's kingside and preparing to contest the c-file. This knight maneuver is a defensive repositioning, aiming to reinforce the d7 square and potentially redeploy to the kingside for defensive or offensive purposes, while also freeing the c4 bishop to support its comrades. This move occupies the central open file, preparing to exert pressure on black's position and potentially support an advance on the kingside or queenside. This move, 20, nb7, prepares to redeploy the knight to a more active square on circa 5, challenging white's control of the central squares and potentially creating pressure on the d3 bishop. This move repositions the knight to a more active square where it can support the kingside advance and potentially eye the weak squares around black's king. The knight repositions to d6, reinforcing the e4 pawn and preparing to challenge white's pieces, particularly the bishop on circa 5, while aiming to control key central squares. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to control key central squares and potentially support a kingside attack or exploit weaknesses in black's pawn structure. The knight on b5 exerts significant pressure on white's queenside pawns and challenges the bishop on circa 5, aiming to create tactical opportunities and improve black's piece activity. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to control key diagonals and potentially support a central pawn advance or a kingside attack. This move centralizes the queen and prepares to challenge white's knight on f5 by potentially exchanging it or forcing it to retreat, while also supporting a future advance of the b-pawn. The knight repositions to a central square, aiming to contest the d5 outpost and potentially reroute to f5 for increased central influence and Pressure on black's position. Rec 8 prepares to contest the open c-file, a crucial battleground where control will dictate future pressure and potential breakthroughs. This move reroutes the bishop to a more flexible square, aiming to support a potential queenside pawn advance or to prepare for tactical operations involving the central squares. This move solidifies the pawn chain and prepares to contest the important d5 square, while also potentially supporting a future g5 advance. This move reinforces the d4 pawn, solidifying white's central structure and preparing potential pawn pushes like e4 e5 or f3 f4 to gain space and restrict black's pieces. This move repositions the bishop, reinforcing the d6 square and preparing to potentially contest the open c-file or support a kingside advance later. This move prepares to transfer the rook to the more active c-file, potentially supporting advances on the queenside or putting pressure on black's c-pawn. This move repositions the knight to a more central square, aiming to challenge white's control of the d6 square and potentially prepare for a future advance, or a switch to the c4 square. This move actively pressures black's queenside pawn structure, aiming to create weaknesses or gain space by forcing a response. Exchanging queens simplifies the position, aiming to utilize the open central files and white's slight pawn structure advantage in the endgame. The exchange of queens simplifies the position and leads to an endgame where white aims to exploit the weakened dark squares and potential knight outposts on the kingside. This move activates the king, bringing it towards the center where it can participate more actively in the endgame play. This rook move repositions the piece to a more active file, potentially preparing to contest control of the open a file or support a kingside advance. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, preparing to contest the open c file and potentially support a pawn advance or pressure white's queenside. The king seeks safety on the safer kingside squares, preparing to join the fight and potentially support a central pawn push or reinforce other pieces. This move repositions the rook to the semi-open c-file, preparing to challenge black's control and potentially create pressure on white's queenside pawns. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to contest the c4 square and potentially support a future queenside pawn advance. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to challenge white's control of the c4 gram8 diagonal and prepare for potential exchanges that could open lines for black's pieces. k1 is a necessary king repositioning, preparing to navigate the king to safety on the kingside and potentially support a kingside pawn advance later in the game. This move repositions the king to a more active central square, preparing to participate in the endgame and potentially support pawn advances. This king move aims to improve the king's safety by moving it towards the center of the board and out of the potential firing line of black's centralized pieces, preparing for potential pawn breaks or a more active role in the endgame. This move repositions the rook to the open a file, activating it and preparing to contest the file or swing over to the kingside if necessary. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square on e1, preparing to potentially redeploy it to c3 or d2 to support the rook on the d file or centralize its influence. This pawn push opens a new avenue for the a pawn, potentially creating an imbalance and forcing white to react to a dynamic threat on the queenside. This pawn exchange opens the b-file and clarifies the pawn structure, creating a more dynamic endgame where active piece play will be paramount. This pawn exchange on a5 opens the b-file for black's rook and creates an unbalanced pawn structure, where white has doubled pawns on the queenside. which may become targets. This move places the rook on the semi-open c-file, preparing to contest it and potentially exert pressure on black's queenside pawns. This move aims to develop the rook to a more active square, potentially supporting a future kingside advance or reinforcing the central presence on the a-file. This move aims to exploit the open c-file and the weakened pawn structure on the queenside, potentially targeting the weak pawns on the a-file or creating further pressure against black's king. This pawn advance seeks to create a passed pawn on the queenside after an eventual capture, potentially leading to endgame complications. This knight maneuver is a strategic repositioning to control key central squares and prepare for potential advances on the kingside or a more active role on the queenside. The knight on b5 is now well placed to support the pawn push to a4, aiming to create a passed pawn on the queenside. The move 40, rb6 strategically repositions the rook to a more active file, threatening to infiltrate black's position and potentially exploit weaknesses on the queenside pawn structure. The rook repositions to the 7th rank, creating threats against white's queenside pawns and preparing to support a potential pawn advance. With a3, this exchange simplifies the position, trading a rook for a rook, which often favors the side with fewer pieces to defend. But here it opens up the b-file for black's rook and aims to create weaknesses in white's pawn structure. After white exchanges rooks, black recaptures on b7, aiming to maintain the doubled rooks on the queenside and prepare for potential pawn play or pressure along the b-file. This move activates the knight, preparing to occupy a more central square and potentially attack weak pawns or create threats on the queenside. With the rook now on the 7th rank, black aims to activate it and potentially challenge white's queenside majority by creating counterplay on the kingside or centralizing the rook. The knight repositions to c2, aiming to redeploy to a more active square, potentially d4, or to support a pawn push on the queenside. The move 43, b-flat3 repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to pressure white's queenside pawn structure and potentially create threats against the knight on c2. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to control the d5 square and prepare for potential breakthroughs or defense against black's pawn advances. The knight repositions to c4 to contest control of the central squares and potentially attack white's queenside pawns or support a future advance of black's queenside majority. This capture removes a well-placed knight that was controlling important central squares and supporting potential pawn advances, simplifying the position and opening lines for the rooks. The exchange of pieces is leading to an endgame where black aims to exploit the slightly weakened white pawn structure by activating their bishops. The rook on a3 now controls the open a-file and prepares to challenge black's doubled pawns on the queenside or potentially support an advance of the a-pawn. The black king centralizes to participate in the endgame, aiming to support the a-pawn and potentially create counterplay in the queenside. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to contest control of the central files and potentially support pawn advances on the queenside. The move kc6 centralizes the king, aiming to contest the open files and potentially support advances on the queenside, while also preparing to defend vulnerable pawns. The bishop repositions to the c1 square, aiming to redeploy to the d2 square, thereby supporting the potential advance of the c-pawn and reinforcing the kingside defense. The move 48, kb5 aims to activate the king, seeking a more active role in the endgame by heading towards the queenside majority and potentially Supporting the A pawn. The rook on A1 is repositioned to a central file, preparing to support potential pawn advances or to actively participate in the game on the A file. If it opens up, while maintaining a defensive posture, the move aims to reinforce the knight on C4 and prepare its advance, while also creating potential mating threats on the kingside by unblocking the H file for the rook. This move prepares to control the A file and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside after the exchange of pieces. This timely check by the rook forces the white king to a less secure square, improving black's initiative and disrupting white's coordinated pieces. This move prepares to reinforce the kingside and potentially centralize the king once the checks are exhausted, while also opening a path for the rook to become more active. The move creates a space for the king to potentially escape from the dangerous A file and simultaneously aims to disrupt white's queenside structure by threatening to advance the pawn further. This move prevents the black king from easily accessing the kingside squares while simultaneously creating a safe corridor for the white king to maneuver, preparing for potential pawn advances or defensive repositioning. The move aims to activate the bishop by rerouting it to a more active square, potentially threatening the A3 pawn and creating tactical possibilities. This move aims to redeploy the bishop to a more active square, potentially attacking black's advanced pawn on A4 and supporting a queenside advance if white can secure the kingside. The move aims to activate the rook on the newly opened D file, preparing to challenge white's control of the central files and potentially support a pawn advance on the kingside. This move aims to improve the bishop's position, shifting it from the potentially exposed diagonal to a more active square where it can control key squares and support a potential kingside advance or exchange on C4. The black king actively seeks central influence, heading towards the queenside majority, while white aims to use the open files to create threats against the weak pawns. This move is a strategic decision to consolidate the king's position and prepare to defend the vulnerable pawns on the queenside by bringing the king closer to the center. The move 55, Road 1 repositions the rook to the D file, aiming to challenge white's control and potentially exploit any weaknesses in the pawn structure on the queenside, while preparing to support the advance of the kingside pawns. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, preparing to defend the king on the newly opened file and potentially support a kingside pawn advance if the opportunity arises. The rook on D3 advances aggressively, aiming to disrupt white's coordination by potentially harassing the king on the H1A8 diagonal or by supporting pawn advances on the queenside. The bishop retreats to F8 to defend the 7th rank and prepare to swing over to the kingside if necessary, but it also opens the D1H5 diagonal for potential counterplay. The rook's retreat to D8 is a defensive maneuver, securing the D file and preparing to potentially reinforce the pawn structure or even swing over to the kingside if white's attack develops there. The bishop retreats to a more active diagonal, controlling key squares and preparing to support the rook's advance along the B file or potentially reroute to a more central position. This move is a strategic redirection, intending to challenge white's queenside control and potentially create an open file for the rook. If white captures on B3, the bishop retreats to A3 to maintain control of the important A7-1 diagonal and prepare for potential kingside activity or defense while keeping an eye on black's advanced pawns. The rook's repositioning to D8 aims to reinforce the central pawn structure and prepare for potential king's side maneuvering or defense. while also keeping options open for supporting a d-pawn advance or a rook lift. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to support a potential kingside advance or to contest the dark squares should black's rook become more active on the 7th rank. The rook retreats to a more passive square, abandoning the central pressure and allowing white to consolidate their advantage on the open c-file and the strong outpost on a3. White aims to reorganize the rooks, potentially preparing for a kingside attack or regrouping to defend against black's pressure on the queenside. This move activates the bishop to attack the rook on f1, creating immediate tactical threats and forcing white to react, potentially disrupting their defensive setup. This move decisively challenges the pawn chain and opens lines for white's pieces, aiming to create threats against black's king and potentially launch a central pawn push. This move forces white's king to move again, gaining valuable tempo for black and preventing white from consolidating their position, while also keeping the d-file open for potential future attacks.